We were so excited to do a fun project on our new property in Texas. And when you've got a lakefront view, what's better than a fire pit overlooking the lake? So we partnered with Waterlocks to use their marine finish to build ourselves a fire pit with a view that will last for years. The first step in the fire pit was staking out the site. And you wouldn't think this would be complicated, but we chose a hexagon shape for our fire pit area and learned that staking out a hexagon is actually a lot more complicated than it sounded. After a bit of trial and error and doing a few different ways, we discovered the easiest way to stake out a hexagon was to drive a dowel in the center where you wanted it to go. And then the face of the hexagon, each edge, is actually the same dimension as half of it from point to point. So we took that dimension and was able to use it on a string, as well as using a measuring tape to stake out the hexagon from the center point out to all 6 points. Once we got it staked out, we put a string around each corner so we could really get an idea of where all of the benches would be sitting and how the view looked from there. Once the site was all staked out, it was time to level it out. We started by removing the grass, ground cover, weeds, whatever we had grown in the area. And then we were attempting to shovel the excess out of the back because our land did slope a little bit, but our ground was just way too hard. So we rented a tiller and was able to break up that ground, and that allowed us to really level it out. That way we wanted to make sure that the benches were all level. To get it that way, it was a lot of raking and shoveling and moving dirt, and I ended up using a level on top of a larger 2x4 to get a general idea of what was more level. And once the area was completely or mostly level, we staked it out again to make sure that we had the final design for the site. Added strings between all of them, and the strings were very important because they are where we are going to be flushing the front of each bench up to get the perfect hexagon. Now it was time to start laying out the bases. We used cinder blocks and cinder block caps for these bases. I actually really like the modern kind of simplistic look of them, and I love the really cheap price tag. So we used 2 cinder blocks and 6 end caps for each level of the bases, and we started by actually putting down the first level and at every single brick checking for level and making sure that it was completely level across the whole base. Then we actually moved the base out of the way, of course keeping track of which brick went in which spot, because once it was perfectly level, it was level for that brick, because obviously all these bricks are not exactly the same size. After we moved it, we put some weed barrier underneath. We really wanted to keep weeds from growing as much as we could. I know we're going to have to be pulling weeds, but to give ourselves a little bit of a head start, the weed barrier will help. We also made sure the weed barrier went inside of the cinder block base, because we're actually going to use this for storage, which is part of the design. And so that inside area we can store things in, like marshmallow roasting sticks. We also want to keep some wild bird seed because we like to feed the ducks when we're down here. And then once the weed barrier was all the way down, we got to start gluing the first row of cinder blocks into place. We used a landscape construction adhesive. It actually says right on it, it's for bricks and pavers. And we put that in the caulk gun and did a really heavy squeeze out in between all of the bricks, making sure to kind of keep any squeeze out off of the construction adhesive to the inside and not to the front. So I kind of went heavier towards the inside of the bricks and a little bit less on the front. And that way it just kept the really clean modern look of these construction or these cinder blocks without having any glue squeeze out. Of course, if there was any, we were able to wipe it away, and it's very, very unnoticeable. And then once the first row was done, we went right on to the second row and attached those, making sure to glue not only from the brick side to side, but to glue it down to the brick below it. We also offset it so that we had a really sturdy base for all of our benches. There were high fives all around when we got this first base assembled, But that was a little premature because we were only 1/5 of the way done because we had 4 more bases to go. So we started with the center base, and then we were able to level that first brick off to the lower level of the base that was already built to make sure that we kept each base level to the one before it. As much as our site was mostly level, this ensured that we kept it looking nice and clean. And then it just a continuous stream of gluing and leveling and getting all of these bases put together. We used about 4 of these giant tubs of that construction landscape adhesive and really just did not go light on it because we wanted these bases to really hold up. But I tried to actually break them apart later, and they are not going anywhere. To set the fire pit, we wanted to actually put it into the ground a little bit to make sure that it was really sturdy, it didn't move around. So I used it as a template to cut around any weed barrier that was in the circle. Then we were able to remove the fire pit and actually use that template of the weed barrier to dig down 2 to 3 inches into the ground. After removing all that dirt, we leveled it out with a level and then stomped it down really firm to make sure that that fire pit was not going anywhere. And some of the excess dirt we dumped in around the outside to give it a really nice secure fit. At this point, I was getting really excited because it was actually starting to look like something. But this next step really was the tipping point for me to start seeing my vision come together, and that was adding a rock. We chose a crushed limestone, not fully crushed, just lots of little rocks as our base. And it's really a beautiful white or very pale grays and beiges. It's a little whiter as we put it in because it had a lot of dust on it, but most of that dust kind of washed away with our first rain. And we filled the rock in to all of the holes from the cinder block. And mostly that was just to make sure that no creatures decided to build a home there. And then we also put about an inch on the bottom inside of all of the bases to give our little storage compartments a little room for drainage because, of course, there's going to be lots of water. And then we put the rest of it in and around all of the benches, and we used a full yard and had at least 3 inches of rocks around all of the bases of the benches. Now that the heavy lifting was done, it's my favorite part, time to get to building. And we measured every single one of these benches in multiple points because, of course, with it being out of the cinder blocks, they're not going to be exactly the same size. And actually, our very first bench that we built was not very square, as we learned. Luckily, you cannot tell after the benches were built and assembled. We just had to give ourselves a little more leeway on that bench to allow it to fit over it. For the benches, I used Douglas fir 2x6s and 2x4s and whitewood 1x6s. They look absolutely amazing with the Waterlox marine finish on them, but they were very, very nice on my budget. So I cut all of the pieces for the bottom frame of the benches, and then we did plane the 2x6s, one side of them. This gave a really great finished edge and also got rid of that little curve on the corner. I used pocket holes to hold all of the pieces of the bench together and added 3 of those to each side of my 2x6 pieces and 2 to all the 2x4s. Assembly of these bench frames is really easy because you're basically just making a rectangle. So I built the outside with the 2x6s, and then these 2x4s are actually going to just hold the bench on top of the base. The 2x6s sit on the outside of the cinder block and cover up the top of it, and then all of the weight of the bench is braced on all of those 2x4s. So after getting the 2x6s attached to the outside, I measured and marked where all of those 2x4 braces are going to go on the inside. And I made sure to make those marks on both pieces at the same time. That way I knew I was getting just a really accurate square design. I attached those 2x4s with pocket hole screws, and it is important to note that I did make sure to use outdoor screws on this whole build because I definitely do not want my screws to rust or to fail after all of this hard work. Before moving on and finishing up the bench, I decided it was a good idea to dry fit it to the cinder block base, and that was a really good thing because we did have one, that center one that was off square, that actually didn't end up fitting, and we had to kind of do a little bit of maneuvering. A chisel ended up working to cut out a couple spots where that not square base was hitting, and then we were able to get it to fit. And also, while we were down there with it dry fit, I decided to attach the last two 2x4 supports on the inside, and these again are just to hold up that base on top of the cinder block, as opposed to having it wobble back and forth. To build the back of the benches, I wanted to have an angle on the board because I find that way more comfortable to sit at. So I modified a jig that I made for the tapered legs that I did on a nightstand build earlier this year. And I'll link to that post in the description so you can see more about that jig. But it's a very simple table saw jig, and I was able to set it up once and then reuse it because I ended up cutting 3 of these back supports for every single bench. We cut all those and attached them with pocket holes. Again, those outside ones, I did use the planer to flatten that out to get rid of that curve on the edge of the 2x6s, and it gave it a really nice look. To go in between these angled back supports, I cut a piece of 2x4, made sure to measure and cut it to fit each individual section, and then I attached them with pocket holes in between so it was flush with the back. And I'd recommend having lots of clamps ready when you are attaching these 2x4s because, as you can see, my not so fancy plywood on top of Sawhorse's table is not very level. So I was really struggling with getting that attached, but I was able to do it with some extra clamping force and make sure that was nice and flush to the back. Now it was time to move on to the seat, and I make sure to measure and cut all of the slats to those measurements because each one of these boxes is slightly different in order to fit the cinder block base. The seat board on the back was cut to fit around that back support, but since it didn't have anything in the center to support it, I ended up putting a pocket hole on each of those corners. While nobody's actually sitting on this, I'm sure my kids will find a way to step on it or some other way to put some force on it. To attach the seat slats, I went with wood glue and nails. I used my nail gun to just tack that in all across, and then I secured that one corner with a pocket hole screw. Because we want to use the bases of these benches as storage, that meant we had to be able to hinge the seat up. So we cut the first slat on the seat so that it was 1 inch cut off and attached that first. Now the reason we need this is because once I got those same slats on the back, there wouldn't have been any room for a hinge. So this gave us a little bit of space. Then we were able to go and attach all of the upper back slats. And again, I just did this with wood glue and nails. And to space them out, wanted about 1/4 inch between them and discovered that my speed squares were just shy of that. And since I had 2, it was really easy for us with 2 hands to quickly space out all of the slats for the back of the chair. And so we put the first one down, making sure it was flush with the top, and then we used those to give us a nice spacing as we attach the other 2. To build the hinging bottoms, we used some more 2x4s as braces. Now these 2x4s are not actually structural at all. They're just holding these seat slats apart at the perfect 1/4 inch angle so that it can hinge up. The seat slats are actually resting upon all of the 2x4 supports that I put in the bases that are sitting on top of the cinder block. So these ones, like I said, they're really just to hold those seat slats. And so I used 4 of them across to give them a nice support. and nailed them and glued them together. Then once that first one was in place, I was able to use the same trick with the speed squares to space them and continue and get all of them attached. And this was another big milestone in the big fire pit project. Seeing the very first bench come together completely made me really excited and anxious to get to building the rest. After testing out the benches at the fire pit area, we discovered that the top was a little sharp, that edge, and the one right in the front. So I gave both of those a quick round over with a palm router. And also, overnight, I decided that I really hated the way that I had put those benches together with the 2x4s sitting upright instead of being a little more flat. We had one of them break because the slat on the very front obviously couldn't be fully supported by that 2x4 because it needed to be able to have room to hinge and not be in the way of the base. So I decided it was time to fix that now instead of having problems further down the road. So I went through all of those seats and tapped off the 2x4s that had been attached, and I had to pull out all those nails and scrape off any bits of glue or 2x4 that was attached to it. And then I laid the 2x4s flat and secured them with some outdoor decking screws. And I feel like this is going to be a much better solution. It also won't be in the way of anything that is stored in there as it is lifting and lowering. And now that all the benches were built, it was time to start applying the finish. But before I talk about that, I do want to note that another design change was made during the process. We had originally planned on having all 5 seats with backs on them. I really like to have some place to rest my back, and I thought that would be more comfortable. But as we were testing things out, I discovered that those front 2 seats with a back on them really impeded the view of the lake, and we wanted to have none of that. So as you can see here, I'm actually putting sealer on one of the bases that does not have a back. And all it meant was we pulled those backs off and we did the seat slats. So there was basically 4 seat slats all the way across. For the back one, it is cut at 1.5 inches on the table saw and then attached, so it gives us a place for that hinge to attach to. And then to start the sealer, it was the first coat was the Waterlock's Tung Universal Tung Oil Sealer. Now this is a buff-in sealer, and it is not going to make them waterproof on their own. We still need that marine finish on the top, but it penetrates because it's made out of tung oil and really gives your wood a perfect start before putting on the other sealer. And it's a buff-in sealer, so all it required was a rag and a few hours to get into all the nooks and crannies of all of the benches. Our super advanced workshop that we're working in, we had 2 pop-up tents that we put on the foundation of our soon-to-be shop and was working under that. It was a little hot in the Texas heat, but manageable as long as we got up at 6 a.m. to work. And here I'm putting on the very first coat of the marine finish. Now the marine finish was really just so easy to apply. It went on very, very smooth with a paintbrush. I didn't have any problems with clumping. One thing you do want to make sure is that you are constantly stirring it so that nothing settles. It adds a really nice warm tone to the wood. So it kept it very, very neutral looking, but warmed it up. And I loved the warmth next to the cinder blocks because the cinder blocks are pretty cold. So the marine finish gave us a really, really warm tone to it. And I think that gives it a really inviting look to the fire pit area. We did put 2 coats of the marine finish on every single bench and top and made sure to get it all around all the different areas because this is sitting on cinder block bases, and the cinder block is also porous so it can hold some of that water. We wanted to protect this wood so it lasted for many, many, many years. And One thing to note when you are applying this Waterlox finish is you don't want to work too far ahead of yourself. Make sure that it doesn't get dry as you're going, just like you would with any finish sealer, because if you work it too much, you'll end up with brush strokes. This is a self-leveling, so you really want to just apply it a little bit and then move on and not come back and touch it too much later. Took me about 3 hours for each coat of sealer on it because it was 5 benches with separate bench tops. The hardest part about applying the Waterlox marine finish was waiting 24 hours between coats. I like to get in and just really get a project done and move on. But the nice thing is you do not have to sand between coats. So waiting 3 days to get the sealer on all of these benches is a small price to pay to have a beautiful finish that is crack-free and will protect our benches and our whole fire pit area for years to come. And now we have the most amazing fire pit area. It's definitely the perfect project to put our stamp on a brand new property. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit like and then subscribe so you can see all the other things that we're going to create on our fun lakeside property.